Hello and welcome to Gender Nebulous Series 2, Episode 2, and we have an amazing guest today. It's the wonderful Nancy Kelly. Hi, Nancy.
Hi there.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm a bit hot.
It is a bit hot, isn't it?
It's warm. I'm a bit shiny. I'm very shiny.
It's raining this afternoon. Obviously, Frida, my co-host, is also here.
Nice to meet you, and thank you for taking the time to do it. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing.
Speak to you in the, like this.
So, Nancy, you are CEO of Stonewall. Is it Stonewall UK or is it Stonewall Europe? Is it the same thing?
It's the same thing. So we just call ourselves Stonewall. Our legal name is Stonewall UK, but we just call ourselves Stonewall.
So can we start with you just telling us a bit of kind of background around how it's your dream job, because I know you've said that in the past on the website, and how you became the CEO of such an amazing organization?
So my background is in kind of social justice issues. Like I've worked for a lot of different campaigning voluntary sector organizations. So kind of Barnardo's and Children's Rights Commissioners and like Refugee Council, and I kind of worked on poverty issues. So I've always kind of worked in human rights and social justice. And then I had a chunk of time doing much more kind of research, sort of data driven jobs, and I knew that I really wanted to come back and do human rights work again, to come back to where I started, and I'd started looking for jobs, and then the Stonewall job came up, and I didn't think I'd get it. In LGBT charities tend to only recruit from inside the LGBT sector, or a lot of them do. Yeah. But the opportunity to kind of lead this organization at this point in time was just too good to miss. And so I kind of threw my hat into the ring, and after many, many rounds of interviews and tests, popped out the other end. And it can be very hard. It's not an easy job, but it is an incredible privilege. And with the community, particularly the trans community, under attack in the way that it is a privilege to be part of trying to kind of stand up for the human rights of trans people and for the whole LGBT community.
And things seem to have got like quite intense in the last few years, especially for us as trans people. We recognise that there is a kind of concerted effort to diminish us and link us to all kinds of threats in society. And it feels like we as people say quite a lot, oh, it's a repeat of what gay and lesbian people went through in the 60s and 70s and 80s. We've got like people talk about Section 28 a lot in reference to things that the government are doing now. Do you think some of those are exaggerated? Because I sometimes worry about referring to other people's struggles, or because my life now is different than it would have been for a gay person in the 60s. So do you think those are fair comparisons?
Well, so I guess there's two ways of thinking about it. One is to sort of think, is what's happening right now serious? And the answer to that is yes, it really is. And it's not just serious here, it's serious in lots of different countries around the world. So you might think there of kind of Hungary, or you might think of, Uganda, or you might think of the USA and what's going on in all of these places in terms of trans rights and LGBT rights more broadly. So I think it's not at all wrong to be really worried about where we're at as a society when it comes to, particularly in the UK, the rights and the kind of personhood of the trans community, of trans people. In terms of the comparisons, I mean, I would sort of tend to the view that comparisons like that are not perfect, but they're instructive. So I can remember those headlines. I turned 50 this year. I was young during the kind of the height of the HIV crisis in the UK, but I can remember kind of day in, day out headlines about particularly gay men, but also lesbians. And, you know, I grew up had some friends who had two mums who were at risk of being removed from their mums because their mums were lesbian, which happened a lot back then. And one of the things that I feel really strongly is that the same lies were told about lesbians and gay men and bi people then as are told about trans people now. So kind of the idea that we're a threat to children, or that we're indoctrinating children, the idea that we're dangerous, you know, for women to be around. So many of those that, you know, that we're mentally ill, these sorts of things. So many of like exactly the same lies, exactly the same negative stories are told, that I feel for that reason, it is actually quite an instructive, quite a useful comparison, not least because there's a lot of people who are more comfy with transphobia than they are with homophobia. So reminding of that time can sometimes help.
So why do you think that, you know, the kind of like the support for trans people is so far behind, you know, that it is for other groups? We seem to be maybe 10, 15 years behind in a lot of cases.
So kind of seen through a more positive lens, you're not going to get a lot of people saying that, but seen through a more positive lens, the public is dramatically more positive. The general public is dramatically more positive about trans people than it was around lesbian and gay. Sorry, my dog's barking.
It's okay.
Than it was about lesbian and gay people in the 80s and early 90s, actually. So, you know, we tend to think because homophobia is much reduced that it kind of has always been like this, but actually the general public was very, very, very homophobic until quite recently. So the public attitudes are pretty good. What you see happening more, I would say, is a kind of, I would call it like an elite bubble problem. You've got a kind of politics and press problem that just obsessively tells these sort of trans hostile stories. And that is starting to impact negatively on public opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I have noticed myself because I follow politics and I listen to Radio 4. I'm really that boring, but you do get you get politicians being asked questions now that you'd like, can a woman have a penis? And it's reductive and it reduces people to body parts. And this has happened with our Prime Minister just this week. And I find it really disturbing, and it is frightening that somebody of that stature, the leader of the country, is playing into these. I mean, I know there's questions to be asked about transgender people and inclusion, but when it's framed in such a way that makes me feel like I am not a person, I'm a problem. I think that's the problem. I think, but how do you think we've got to that point? Do you think it's because of just the press wanting to try and get, you know, kind of like get one over on a politician by asking a stupid question? I noticed Nick Ferrari has done that quite a lot on LBC.
I would say there's a few different things going on. So there's like, on the one hand, the process of exiting the EU meant that our Conservative government was more reliant on the hard right of its party and the more religious right of its party than it's been for a long time. So the kind of the sort of domestic political environment shifted a bit. At the same time, you know, you have a few years back in the US when the evangelical religious right loses the fight on marriage equality, it pivots quite quickly to thinking about kind of being trans hostile as a kind of entry point. And you've got to remember, you know, a lot of money comes out of the American religious right, including into Europe. You can look at, and the UK, you can look at reports by the Global Philanthropy Partnership for this that track those big international flows. You've got money coming in, you've got kind of shift rightwards, you've got a media that needs to make money from clicks, right? So there's, you know, and kind of hate sells, and all of these things come together. But what you can see when you look internationally is that strategy of like focusing on othering trans people has become a feature of what they call the anti-gender movement, which kind of targets LGBT rights and women's rights all around the world. It's become a kind of key feature of the anti-gender movement everywhere. In the UK, it's very focused on trans people, but in other countries, it's much kind of more broad-based.
I mean, we've seen how, terrible things are getting in the States at the moment with all these anti-trans laws, and how some of those are making their way over here.
Well, people are traveling, aren't they, out of the States?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, there's people leaving states like Florida, to go to other states where they feel safer. My big fear is that it gets worse and it spreads over here in a much wider way. When we talk about funding, a lot of that money that is being used by Republicans to do those things, I feel as though that is kind of based in religious extremism, the far right, and it is making its way over here. So organizations like Stonewall, I mean, hopefully we're fighting those somehow. I mean, can you talk about that a little bit? Is Stonewall kind of involved in fighting against those, that source of money coming in like that?
So we work in the UK, but we also work internationally. So we work with other LGBT human rights organisations all around the world. And we try and fight back against that kind of anti-LGBT, anti-rights movement in a few different ways. So outside of the UK, we share kind of intelligence, we share strategies, we collaborate with other LGBT rights organisations and trans rights organisations. We work with kind of the UN systems, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, or the Council of Europe, all the kind of big international rights bodies, to really encourage them in their work, to strengthen the pressure the international community brings to bear on countries around adhering to human rights. And then here in the UK, obviously, in a way, you can think of Stonewall as the lobbying arm of the LGBT movement. So we work really closely with movement colleagues, but we do a lot of the kind of parliamentary work and the media work and all of that piece. And over here, where we try and place our emphasis when it comes particularly to sort of a trans rights backlash is on protecting and promoting human rights of trans people. So my colleague Colin, for instance, was really influential in getting the gender recognition reform bill passed in Scotland, sadly blocked by Westminster. We're working really hard to discourage the government at the minute from considering changing the Equality Act. So it kind of operates on lots of different levels. But truthfully, I mean, we are, I think, the third biggest LGBT rights organization in the world, and we're not that big, right? So
I was looking for what is the Stonewall strapline, and I think what it comes down to is LGBTQ human rights, part of a global movement for change, and kind of building that world where LGBT people can be free to be themselves, and live their lives to full. I mean, that seems to be like the core of what you do.
Yeah, we're part of a movement. We're not, we're not kind of some giant organization that's doing it all its own. We're part of a movement from grassroots to the unions, to all kinds of organizations that want a world where LGBT people can thrive, Yeah,
and some of the work you do with the diversity champions and the workplace equality indexes, I mean, those really, I mean, my company gets involved with those. I mean, it's not to the level I'd like, but they're getting there. So, we have seen a lot of companies leave. Could you talk about around some of those, what you think some of the reasons are? Because we've seen organisations like the BBC, EHRC, even House of Commons have left Stonewall's kind of
Diversity Champions Programme. So what's all that about? Well, there's a couple of things. For people who don't know, the Diversity Champions Programme is a kind of membership program that works with workplaces to make them more LGBT inclusive for colleagues and for customers and service users. So to make them basically more inclusive. And then the Workplace Equality Index is like a bit of an audit of how well people are doing. And yes, some people have left, but we still work with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of organisations around the UK and over 200 global organisations. So plenty of people have stayed and plenty of people are joining. What we experienced a couple of years ago nearly now is a very coordinated attack on that programme. So I think we had something like 900 Freedom of Information Act requests concerning the Diversity Champions Programme, and there had been kind of coordinated by people who were opposed to our stance on trans
Yeah.
rights and trans inclusion,
Yeah.
that were then passed over to the press. And we had this very, very sustained period of press attacks during Pride Month, actually, which was a bit weird.
Well,
and
probably not as weird as you think.
well, it's a funny way to celebrate Pride, I always feel,
Yeah.
attacking a large LGBT organisation.
Mhm.
But that kind of was deliberately done to kind of engineer a situation where we were seen as politicized or too politicized. And so some of those kind of high profile organizations that you're talking about who left the program, you know, that's the reasoning. And then of course the press covered them leaving the program, so it became a sort of self-fulfilling cycle.
I did notice in the press it became this free speech issue.
Yeah.
But when you look at who is most keen to have that free speech, they never have anything nice to say. You know what I mean? It seems to be
a lot of the organizations leaving seem to be somehow related to the government and what the government, or certain people within the government, were doing at that time and still are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, people talk about free speech, and they talk about free speech sometimes as if you can't have free speech and human rights and human dignity at the same time. And of course you can. You know, and one of the things I quite often point out is that, so I'm a lesbian. I've spent all of my career, apart from when I worked at Stonewall, in outside of the LGBT sector. I've worked with plenty of people, typically for religious reasons, who think lesbians are going to go to hell. And we've rubbed along fine, because do you know what? While we've been at work, they've not held forth about that with me.
Yeah.
And we've talked about, you know, the research report we're writing or the campaign we're running together. So when you're talking about workplace inclusion for trans people, it's no different than when you're talking about, you know, workplace inclusion for a lesbian or for an ace person. It's about understanding that people can hold whatever beliefs they want, and they're entitled to hold those beliefs, and they're entitled to express those beliefs. But when you're in a workplace and you express them in a way that's harmful to somebody else, then that's something that workplaces should manage. So
yeah, I mean, for me,
simple,
you know,
really.
that thing about free speech is okay. Yeah, free speech, but you know, it doesn't come without consequences. You have to be, if you want your free speech, you have to own the consequences of what you've said too.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's like in my place of work, it's like there are people that think, oh, trans women, we dictate in terms. You have to say this, you have to say that. So I have the most fascinating conversations with people that ask me about being trans, and it opens up like this whole thing for them. Where they also, what do you do with this situation? What do you do in that situation? It's like, it's just a natural conversation to talk about gender with me, because they know I can answer those questions. So a lot of people in the media, they talk about it as if trans women or trans people in general trying to shut down a conversation. No, we actually, you know, as long as you're coming at it from good faith, you know, and if you've got a genuine question, because I've been in like training meetings, like diversity meetings and stuff, and then the person running the class spots me and they say, well, I think you should come up actually and talk about this, Frida, because you're the person that's lived this experience. And that's how it should work. It shouldn't be like, oh, we've got to all be quiet now because Frida's here. Do you know what I mean? I think people get that the wrong way around, don't they?
I really agree with that. And I also think sometimes people who are kind of more hostile to trans people don't get some like very basic stuff. Like I don't know any trans people who haven't thought deeply about sex and gender, for instance. Like by definition, trans people have spent a lot of time thinking about that and thinking about what it means to them. And so the idea that you can't, as you say, have a really complicated, individual, nuanced conversation with a trans person about sex and gender that's a bit of a mistake. I think they're it's pretty much the only community you can definitely have that conversation with, actually.
And then the other situation is where you know, trans people are just not included in the conversation whatsoever. You know, it's like we're not there, we're not in the room. I mean, that happens a lot too.
You feel like as a especially me, because I write about this a lot, I've had to become a sports scientist, I've had to become a lawyer, I've had to look into prisons, I've had to teach all this stuff to myself and learn about it, not because I would have needed to know in general life, but because these things are coming at me, I have to work this stuff out and think, right, so where do I sit within this conversation? So we think about this stuff more than anyone. You know, we think, are we a problem? Is this going to be a problem for me? You know what I mean? And it's this constant kind of paranoia. Are we getting the conversation right? But at the end of the day, you can't know everything. And you know, these kind of vexatious kind of points that come up in the media about single-sex spaces. I've never had a problem with single-sex spaces in any place I've ever been in. But now there are young trans girls I know that are saying, "Oh, I'm really nervous about going out because what if I'm seen somewhere?" And I think you should never feel like that, because if somebody's aggressive towards you, it doesn't matter what, you know what I mean? It's their problem. It's that they've got a problem with you. And I always try and make those positive messages, even though sometimes it's hard to be positive with the stuff I have to write about, you know.
Yeah.
So Stonewall recently had a new chairperson, haven't they? Ian Anderson.
That's right. Yeah.
So what? And not sure how long he's been there now. It feels like it's been a few months, if not longer.
It is. It's about 6 months, I think, but I'm rubbish at time. So
Ian is the chairperson.
That's right. He's chair of our board
of the board. Your
that's
boss,
right.
Chairman of the board.
So I'm just curious as to, you know, somebody at that level who's come in as a new, I'm not sure where Ian came from, but he's come in as a new chairperson. What are their kind of responsibilities for the overall, you know, Stonewall organization?
Yeah. So the way that all charities work is that kind of, it's a bit different to a company. So with a charity, kind of 95% of what happens is run by the executive. So me and my team. And the kind of high level strategy and strategic direction of the organization is done with the approval of your board of trustees. So kind of, it's like a governance structure. It looks at our kind of finances. It looks at is what we're doing in line with our charitable objectives? Is what we're doing in line with our strategy? And when every 4 years or so we do a strategy setting process, the board is a big part of that. So they're quite, charity boards are about kind of good governance and good management. They're a bit different from a company board, where they're very a kind of company board. People are much more involved in the day to day. And so Ian's got a big day job. He runs a great big public affairs company. And then this is his Stonewall's his time consuming hobby.
Right. So he leaves all the details for you to sort out, does he?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds about right. There was something else that I really caught my attention when it came out, was your interview with Al Jazeera.
Yes.
Yourself and Christine Burns. I thought it was great. I watched that. I think I watched it twice. It was so good. I was really surprised that Al Jazeera were that positive and did an interview that well. I mean, maybe that's my prejudice towards Al Jazeera, because I think we're kind of taught to be prejudiced against Al Jazeera for many reasons.
Yeah.
But I mean, that interview was amazing. And the topic was, you know, what is behind the rise of transphobia in the UK. I don't know if you remember what you said at the time, but
I can't. It's a long time.
I'm going to put you on the spot and just ask you if you could just talk about that for.
Well, I will. I mean, I think I'll just comment on why it's unusual. You don't very often get two people who agree with each other about trans people's personhood, human rights, etc. One of whom is trans, allowed to speak on the same program with a non-hostile journalist.
I think that was the shocking thing.
I think the overall experience was quite unusual for that.
What struck me is because normally when I've seen things like that, they frame it in such a way that
you normally get like, here's like 4 anti-trans people, maybe no trans people, but this was the complete opposite. It's a trans person and the CEO of Stonewall. It's like, what's going on?
So I think we talked a lot about the sorts of things we've touched on already. So, you know, that the country, you know, our politics generally has become a bit more fractious, a bit more kind of right wing rather than centre right. That you've got kind of money and ideas that are flowing in from kind of the US religious right, hard right, and then you've got this kind of. There was a bit of a powder keg around the initial attempt to reform the Gender Recognition Act in the UK. And I think one of the things that I would sort of observe about that, well, 2 things. First, it wasn't the trans community's priority. Trans community's priority at the time, like now, would have been access to healthcare, access to good quality housing, kind of protection from
it's
hate
reflected
crime.
in how many people actually have one, because I think it's less than 5,000 people in the whole country.
Yeah. So I think at the time, and this was before my time at Stonewall, but at the time there was a feeling in government as well as in the movement that actually reforming the GRA would be straightforward and was actually a lot more easy than fixing the trans healthcare system, right? What little did we know. But I think the thing about gender recognition reform is it really enables people who are trans hostile to reduce trans people's rights and personhood to a kind of verbal game.
Yeah.
So what is a woman? What does it mean to be recognized as a woman? Can women have a penis? All of that stuff you were talking about earlier kind of lends itself to that, as opposed to if you're talking about hate crime or access to gender affirming healthcare, it's a bit more hard to make that abstract.
Well, I was just going to mention that because they try to, there are people, without mentioning names, who try and make it a philosophical argument, like this is about womanhood, this is about, when you look at the details of their arguments, they're actually they're perfectly politically posed arguments, and it's kind of like academic law, where it said, oh yeah, they can, they can sort of make something work on paper, but in social reality, in the reality that I live in and Vicky lives in, and you live in as well, but those arguments don't work because you could theorize and you could have it's like there's the legal feminist argument that we've got to find the problem, whereas they've got to find the problem and then build a law around the problem which doesn't exist. That's how it feels.
I think what you're saying has got a lot of truth to it. I mean, I think that what matters is how people are treated in reality and how trans people are treated in reality. I think it matters how safe, you were talking about young trans girls earlier and feeling unsafe in kind of public spaces and maybe kind of just going around their day-to-day life, and I can understand why.
Well,
I think
it got
that
quite
matters,
personal,
right?
I think, for us. Yeah.
I mean, it's I sometimes have said, and it is true for me at least, I think trans women are women. I believe trans women are women. That's my truth. That's how I feel. But I don't really care if anybody else believes that. I care about people treating trans people, including trans women, well and with respect, and supporting trans people to be safe in their day-to-day lives. So that very sort of abstract, what is a woman?
Yeah.
What makes you a woman? What makes me a woman? How exactly are we going to police the toilets, right? That very abstracted argument is really toxic, and it's got, as you say, absolutely nothing to do with the lives we actually live.
Well, I have noticed this on a more personal level because I'm up in Manchester, and we had the tragic murder of Brian Ajayi, and we went to the vigil, and what I felt there was like all these people come together. It was so overwhelmingly, but those people's concerns are not philosophical. They're about being beaten up on this. They're concerned about being beaten up on public transport. It's all right to have these lofty ideas of like Jordan Peterson and break things down into, but for those people on the street, because I volunteer for the LGBT Foundation. So there were people there who knew of Brian. It was a personal thing for them. They knew of her because they followed her on TikTok. So for them, it's not a philosophical argument.
It's not, and it's not philosophical for the thousands and thousands of trans people that are on waiting lists for 5 years long for a first appointment. It's not philosophical for trans people that are experiencing hate crime. It's like year on year doubling of hate crime for the last few years. It's about
the reality
lived
of that
reality.
The GRA wouldn't stop anybody getting beaten up. So that's why why it's important.
You look at the general kind of hatred that we see online all the time on places like Twitter. I mean, it's just never ending. It seems to be getting worse.
Well, just this morning,
Frida's just been talking about young trans people getting more afraid to just live their normal lives. I mean, I'm quite confident in myself, but I can understand someone who's quite young or just come out. It must be terrifying now, because it was terrifying when I did it, and things were a lot better then.
I mean, I think what you see on social media generally, and kind of Twitter specifically, actually, since its new ownership, is just kind of farming of hate. So you see just incredibly large volumes of kind of people piling on to anything even vaguely trans inclusive, and you know it and it's relentless, and there's kind of lots of bots, but you know it's also this kind of big sort of international swarm of people kind of going around just saying toxic, horrible stuff. And I think that, you know, I can look at a company that puts do you remember when bless them, love the Women's Institute.
Oh yeah,
Love the Women's Institute. And do you remember when they first put out the cover with, I forget her name, but the kind of
I know
really
the one you mean, yeah.
Women's Institute trans woman cover where she's like practically holding jam, you know, it was so wholesome. And you know, it was just like the end of the world had happened on social media. I'm like, it's the WI.
That was Petra Wenham.
That's it, Petra. So rubbish.
Petra and her wife,
But like, but you can see it in like clockwork. It will be like rah, 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 rah. And I think the sad thing is a lot of organizations back down. What's great about the WEI is they're just like, no.
I mean, they've been around so long, they don't care.
It's quite sad. It's quite sad that you see the comments disabled on a lot of posts, because I'd like to interact and say thanks for doing this, you know, to a lot of smaller organizations. But it seems to be even, I mean, I can't imagine the kind of stuff Stonewall get on Twitter, but even small organizations like the LGBT Foundation, we did a video just to include, it was called like Including All Women. And they had to take it down because the amount of negativity. I said, don't ever take things down, just disable the comments. I was like trying to fight for it, but they said, no, we're going to put it up again. I said, if you put it up again, the same thing will happen. But it's like, no, we're not going to stop doing it though, are we? Because if we give up because of these people, we might as well not bother, you know.
I mean, so firstly, the LGBT Foundation is nearly as big as Stonewall, just saying, it's not small. Paul will tell you off for saying it's small.
Well, just in my little part of it in Manchester, I feel like it's a little network.
It feels like it's just one office in Manchester. It's probably
not. It's a pretty big org. But anyway, when we work with organizations or with partners, one of the things we try and talk to them about is understanding that will happen and understanding how to manage it. Because I think one of the things is, if you've not experienced that before, if you've not experienced that pylon, if you've not seen it, it's totally overwhelming. Your comms team goes into panic, you know, it's all kind of klaxons and lights, and it's terrifying and it's gross. Whereas if you go into it knowing there's a lot of organized online hostility around trans people, and what that means is when you put out, you know, a nice picture of the WEI magazine or whatever, or, you know, a Pride Month post that is trans inclusive or whatever, that you are going to experience potentially a pylon. And these are the kind of things that might get said, but actually this is not what the majority of people feel. And here's how you can support your team so they don't panic. And here's how you can just kind of stand your ground, really, and continue to advocate for what you believe in.
It's quite sad that we have to do that, though, isn't it?
Sorry, go on, Frida.
I was just going to say, it's quite, because we like when they do a new post, and there's like when they do something new on Twitter, it's like, right, we're braced, we're ready. It's like we brace and we go, right, well, we'll get through it. But we shouldn't have to do that. And unfortunately, that's just I think it is a very Twitter thing at the moment, because
and you look at all the hate the mermaids have had. You know, and some of that was related to LGBT Alliance, and I'm sure, you know, Stonewall got a load of that as well. I mean, I'm not asking you to talk about that particular issue, but, you know, today there was my company, I'm not going to say the name of the company, but they tried to put out a statement that was supportive of trans people in the wake of what the government's trying to do with the removal, you know, the changing of the definition of sex in the Equality Act. And they kind of framed it around this was affecting LGBT people rather than saying it's affecting trans people and non-binary people. So they put out this kind of very bland and, you know, not very well written, in my opinion, statement. And they only put it out to the members of the LGBT group within the company. They didn't put it out as like across the board. So I'm wondering, your organization, Nancy, Stonewall, do you help organizations like the one I work for to come up with better wording for those kind of things, and kind of
we do. So
tell them how to do it in a way that you know, is kind of the best language to use?
Yeah, I mean, particularly sometimes with our diversity champions, sometimes actually organizations just reach out to us and say, we're really We're keen to have a kind of campaign that's really focusing on LGBT people's creativity or LGBT people's kind of parenthood or whatever. And can we get advice, or can we work with you? And so, yeah, we try to support people firstly to do a good job, but secondly to do something they're happy to stand by. And I think some of that is, I mean, there are so many amazing organizations, including amazing businesses that really know what they believe in when it comes to human rights. And those organizations tend to find it much, much easier to just kind of to stand their ground and to talk about the things they believe in and be comfortable with it. And so I think it's really important for, my view would be, it's better for an organization to sort of start small but in a way that's authentic, because if they start small but in a way that's authentic, they're going to stick with what they're saying. And then they maybe can build the degree to which they speak out around these matters. But again, it'll be authentic and they'll be confident. I think where sometimes things come a bit unstuck is organizations kind of want a big public splash, but they're not quite ready to do that yet, and they haven't maybe done the internal work. And then there's a backlash, and then everybody panics, and then the chief exec is running around going, how did this get signed off? Or do you see what I mean?
So and then I think some of the teams that do that work, some of the teams that do that work, they're not familiar with their issues because they're not, you know, they don't deal with it daily themselves. They're the kind of, you know, they're putting out messages, but they don't really understand the ins and outs of all the you know, the details. So I think companies like mine, although it's a massive company, they do get a bit nervous when they talk about these issues because
they have to tell them to talk
don't
to us.
really have much experience with it.
Yeah, of course. And why would they, right?
And why would they? True. But yet they're still trying to work their way up the, you know, the diversity, your workplace equality index. You know, they've come from way down somewhere to in the top 100 now. So they are making progress. But you know, there are times when I wish I could just call up Nancy and have Nancy talk to somebody in the office.
Well, you can call up Nancy and Nancy will talk to somebody in the office. That's the answer.
Keep that, bear that in mind.
I'll bear that in mind. And the other talk that you did more recently was the one, the TEDx talk that you did in London about the conversion therapy. Now that was, you know, it was amazing. I have listened to it several times. How was it doing that? Because I'm sure you were a bit nervous doing that one.
It was absolutely, completely fucking terrifying is how that was. So
I just admit, no, I haven't seen it yet. I was only made aware of it today. So I'm going to catch up with it tonight.
Bless your heart for that honesty. Obviously, I expect you to watch it 3 times in penance. But so the fantastic woman called Mariam, who's from TEDx London, reached out, and she'd read something that I'd written about trans rights in, I think it was The Guardian. I'd written like an opinion thing and said, we'd love you to come and do a talk. And and kind of said, you can talk about anything you want, basically. And I said, I really want to talk about conversion practices and how they impact on the trans community, because as you know, and as probably some of the people listening know, that the government for a very long time has been resisting having a ban on conversion practices, but specifically a trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices. So it was just such a good opportunity to talk specifically about that. When I said yes, I didn't realize I had to memorize it.
Right. You actually memorized the whole thing.
You have to memorize the whole thing. Yeah, that's how it works. There's no teleprompter.
So
I was all like,
it's not a short speech.
It's not. It's 15. It's like 15 minutes is about what they are. So then after I realized that, I obviously was terrified, but the team was like super supportive. If anyone ever gets a chance to do a talk with them, I would really, really recommend it. Really, really skilled. And it was it was a real honor to get to stand on stage at Sadler's Wells and speak to that issue. And it also felt like a real, I don't know how to put it, but it's kind of a big stage. The sort of TEDx stages are big, and
big audience.
It's a big audience, and I felt so conscious of wanting to do right by trans survivors of conversion practices. And so, you know, I worked really, really hard at it, and
it was great. I loved it.
I was pleased to have the opportunity to say what I said.
Mm.
It was really great.
I was
Frida,
gonna,
you need to
yeah.
watch it. I'm going to put you into
Yeah, I'm going to
attention.
watch it. So I really hate this term conversion therapy because the word therapy in there just, I mean, it should
That's why we
never be.
call it conversion practices, you see.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as soon as I see that, I think, gosh, that's just
Yeah,
that
it's
just sounds,
abuse. It's abuse, and
yeah.
there's loads and loads of
Yeah.
And
evidence that it can
there's
cause
a lot.
lifelong harm.
There's this talk a lot about gender affirming care, but it's like, well, if you're not affirming what you're doing, you're
Yeah,
converting.
yeah.
You know, because it's like the conversation has to come, especially with younger people. I get this a lot that the younger trans, like in the teens, they're like they know what they want. They know exactly. They're telling their parents what they want from a very young age. So by the time they get to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, they already along that path.
They've done a lot of thinking about it. I think one of the things that's like really common to a lot of conversion therapy or conversion practices bands around the world is that they use a similar form of language. So they say it's an attempt to change or suppress someone's gender identity or sexual orientation. And the reason I think that that's really important is it helps if you think about like trans healthcare and gender affirming healthcare and all of these kind of conversations about what's appropriate and inappropriate in that space. If you're not trying to, if you're trying to change someone, if you're trying to make someone who says they're trans not trans, if you've got an outcome in mind,
yes,
whether it's making someone cis or making someone trans, that's the problem. If you don't have an outcome in mind, you're just supporting someone to understand themselves, you know, including asking them questions about how they understand themselves. That's not a conversion practice, right? That's not
it's
like
really. Yeah, I was going to say it's really frightening what's happening in America because we've seen attacks on gender clinics and people are making maps of where gender clinics are. And it reminds me of what went on. I mean, it probably still goes on with abortion clinics where you don't, and doctors were shot, you know, and people forget this stuff really quickly. If you create a moral panic, there are enough people with guns in America. You don't want to create that panic. And obviously we have it's different here, but you still, I mean, I've never seen so much confusion in the press. Even writers that do want to write a balanced article seem to have a both sides approach to something like this. I'm like, no, there's no both sides here. There's these people who hate us. You know, it's really hard to.
It's a volume problem, right? So, you know, the UK press has been writing obsessively about trans people for years now. And when we say obsessively, we mean it's not that unusual anymore for there to be more than 1,000 articles a month.
Yeah.
Which, when you think of how few trans people there are in the UK, this is wildly disproportionate.
This is true because I actually did this experiment because I went onto the Daily Mail and typed in transgender and I got I think the first 25 articles featured somebody called Dylan Mulvaney, and I'm sure you've heard of him. But
she's lovely.
But the obsession with her is this thing that, oh, well, she's that's her act. You're actually celebrating her act in a way because she's, I mean, even though the article is negative, the thing that it's actually picking up on is the entertainment value of it.
Yeah.
But the problem is they connect those with serious articles. So when there is something in the gender recognition reform, when there's a policy, there'll be a Dylan Mulvaney article, and people won't get to see the truth of things.
Yeah, so let's remember it was one can of beer, you know.
Yeah. I mean,
one can of not very good beer.
Well,
I mean, I think
that's true.
Or like, I think a lot of the big media companies now will have like a whole section on their website that it'll often be called something like transgender issues, for instance, and that just shows you the volume of the writing, and I think and the volume of the broadcasting, and what that does is it makes it really hard for people to break out of that cycle of we must have someone that is concerned about trans people, or we must sort of frame it in that way.
I got to make something really interesting happen to me because I had been pestering Talk TV and GB News, said this, what you've said here is wrong, and I'll prove to you why it's wrong. And I actually spoke to the digital editors and they said, well, do you want to write something for us? And I thought, oh God, am I sleeping with the enemy? And then I did write something for them and it went out and I thought, oh gosh, you say brace for the hate. Oh my God, the torrent of abuse I got just for changing their narrative a tiny bit. It was just one article and they've asked me to do a couple of other things. But the fact that I think in that sphere, in that tabloid sphere of like Julia Hartley-Brewer, I've been on there and I know what I'm getting into when I go on to something like that, but I just, it's the social media after. You know what I mean? So, because they don't want you to be on their side.
So Frida's been on a lot of kind of, what we would refer to as right-wing TV, various shows where, and afterwards the pile on Twitter is absolutely horrendous. I mean, I don't really have the confidence to go on those shows.
Well,
sometimes you think, are you doing the right thing going on there? Because you're basically sleeping with the enemy while you're doing it.
Well, I've been
But
criticised.
then the other thing is, the other side of it is that, you're the lone trans voice in that hostile environment, and maybe you do make some difference. And what do you think about that, Nancy? I mean, going on those kind of horror shows, I call them.
Well, I mean, I think a few different things. Firstly, I think that trans people should advocate for themselves in whatever way feels right and empowering to them, right? I'm like random cis woman, so I probably shouldn't comment too much. I do think that the kind of way in which trans people are pushed out of the public conversation is a massive problem. Like I'm lucky enough to be friends with Robin White, who's an amazing lawyer and discrimination barrister. And Robin started.
We know Robin.
Yeah, okay. So Robin started to do a bit more media work recently, and I love to see Robin doing media work because she's just very difficult for trans hostile folks to deal with because she's just very unreactive and super just like lawyery. And I think it's just really important. I think it's important that trans people are given as much space as possible to speak for themselves. And I think at the minute, the big problem is it's very rarely given to any trans person unless it is a setup, unless it is, or unless it is very hostile.
It's always framed.
If I can just speak to that a little bit, because like people have said to me, why are you doing this? You're being set up. But you see, my attitude is always, I'm going in here to ask why they're having this conversation. I'm not here to defend my identity. I'm not there to have a conversation about sports, prisons, or whatever they've concocted. I'm there to say, why are you talking about this now? What is the motivation? And that is the only reason I'm there. And usually I don't always win them over, but because I'm not biting, I'm not actually I'm not trying to prove that the false point they're trying to make. It kind of it turns the conversation a bit more human because I'm Frida. I'm a human being then.
And I mean, I think what you're saying about that is also really important, right? So all of the evidence tells us that, like, when we know somebody from a community, it's harder to feel prejudiced against them.
Yeah.
And that's true of all different kinds of communities. And you can see it in all of the data about attitudes to LGBT people, right? Like if the more of us you know, the more you like us, basically.
Yeah.
And because the trans community is pretty small, and because the kind of binary trans community is even smaller, so kind of, I think it's 0.1% of the population is a trans woman or a trans man. So kind of these are pretty small populations. Small numbers. Not everybody knows a member of the trans community in real life or knows they know somebody, right?
Yeah.
And so I think visibility is a real double-edged sword, particularly for trans women, I think. But it also means every time somebody gets to hear a trans person speak, and that trans person is just living their life and speaking their truth in a straightforward way, that's another kind of chip away at transphobia.
I mean, what's interesting is, like, I've been on those kind of shows where they've become a bit adversarial and I've had to fight my corner a little bit. But I think the producers of those shows and the people working behind the scenes have always said, are you okay? It's like there's a different culture behind the screen than there is.
It's like a setup. The show itself is a setup, but then the people behind the scenes are actually helping you.
Because I've had producers ring me and said, I'm really sorry about that. And I said, no, it's fine. I'm fine. Don't worry about it. But I think that's quite telling about how the culture is. And like when I sometimes say, well, why did I bother doing that? What have I actually achieved? Have I done anything positive for the community? But actually, I'm not necessarily representing a community. I'm representing just getting in the way of if the conversation was about anything, I think I'd want to challenge it because that's who I am. I'm quite gobby, So, and to be given an opportunity to be on, on Rupert Murdoch's platform, I think I would take it.
So let's talk about Scottish GRA reform briefly.
Let's do it.
I mean, I was really happy that they got it through, and everything was going
Oh
great.
gosh, we were loving that.
And then what happened? Tories came along and ruined it all.
Westminster blocked it. So I mean,
This is actually unprecedented action, wasn't it?
Yeah,
it's the first use of that section of the Scotland Act, right? So
I forgot
none of us
35, wasn't it?
Section 35, yeah. So none of us anticipated that.
No.
I'd gone up to support my colleague. I mean, because it got really nasty, the Gender Recognition Reform Bill debates at the end. And I was actually on Christmas holiday with my family. My family live up in Whitley Bay. And so I went up to support my colleagues. Actually, I was sat with my colleague Colin and his mum.
This is Colin McFarlane.
Colin McFarlane, who's director of Stonewall Scotland.
Scottish representative for Stonewall.
That's right. That's right. Wow. And you know, it was such an uplifting moment when it passed.
Yeah.
And there were people. Sorry, I'm getting passed a note by my youngest. There were people within the trans community and the wider LGBT community that had been lobbying for like 6-7 years. And we were ecstatic. And I thought the government might slow down implementation. You know, I thought there would be a bit of gumming up the wheels.
Yeah.
But we absolutely didn't expect like
an
constitutional crisis and an outright block. Yeah, it was such a shock.
What came to light to me about that when I looked into it is a lot of the vexation, a lot of the people organising against it weren't even from Scotland. They were people out of Westminster lobby groups again, who seem to have a lot. When you look at when they did the Sex Matters, I think it was, did the petition.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the amount of voting in that, it's all kind of up in Scotland. And I think it was because it was so campaigned against the reform, and they've kind of I mean, it just seemed relentless, the amount of negative news at the minute. Obviously, they had the Isla Bryson case.
Yep. And yet, despite all of that, that bill still passed with an overwhelming majority and with cross-party support, right? So I think this is where you get into that kind of real kind of looking glass thing about there is the kind of media and politics that sort of churns away constantly around these sort of slightly transphobic frames. And then there's real life when people have to stand up and vote about whether or not their constituents have a slightly more dignified process of amending their birth certificate. And I think what you saw is the Scottish Parliament, you know, voting for change. And it's what was interesting today. I don't know if you've seen it, but TGEU, the European kind of trans movement organization. It's not even a survey. It's all of the sort of official statistics from countries that have got legal gender recognition based on declaration, so self-ID as it gets called.
Yes. Yeah.
And what it shows across all of those countries in Europe is, of course, there isn't a problem with fraud. There isn't a problem with gender equality and gender equity. There isn't a problem with safety. You know, more trans people get a GRC when it's easier and more dignified to get a GRC, and that's it, and that's all.
So those facts speak for themselves, in my opinion.
Yeah. And they do tend to concentrate on the transgender children debate when these things of the self-ID come up. I think self-ID is a bit of a misnomer as a thing because we all self-ID, but
we're definitely all identifying our own selves to each other. Exactly.
Yeah. So when I was going to ask, sorry, I lost my place there. Do you think they were like, when they bring up the children, it's like do you think there is any concern there for the self-ID? Because I sometimes, because we've had the thing with the schools today, like Rishi Sunak is like putting out some guidance. Do you think that is all just scare stories, or is there some substance to that?
Well, I think firstly, one of the things I think that goes on with all of these issues is that I think cis people generally find it very hard to imagine themselves into a trans person's existence.
Yes.
Right. So and so when people think about, for instance, surgery, particularly, you will hear people talking about it in a way where you kind of listen and you're like, well, yes, of course you don't feel like that about your chest, because
And they kind of
you're
project that onto trans
yeah,
people, don't they?
exactly. And so I think the same sort of thing happens with children. You know, I'm a parent, I've got 2 kids. Like a lot of people, not just parents, like a lot of people, I'm enormously protective of children, particularly my own, obviously. And you can hear people, they sometimes go, well, you know, my son, you know, used to wear a ballet skirt for a bit when he was 4 and da, 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 da. And it's like, well, but that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, that's not the same. And so I think the first part of that kind of focus on children amongst people that aren't deliberately being transphobic. So I guess I'm really talking about why do the public get so caught up in that stuff, is that I think it's quite hard for parents of cis children to imagine having a trans child without just going, oh, it's like when Billy, you know, wore pink that one time.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of what's going on. And I think, but I also think, you know, I think with trans children, and I do believe trans children exist as well as children who question their gender. I don't think you miraculously.
Well, I was a child once. So.
Yes, exactly. We don't miraculously turn 18 and acquire the ability to be sort of somehow genuinely trans. I think that like the best people to make decisions about trans children and their healthcare are the children and the people that know them and love them, like together. As for every other medical decision, I don't see it as, personally, I don't see it as different from all of the other contexts in which children and young people with caregivers, with families, and on their own, where they've got the capacity to do so, make decisions about healthcare. And the fact that you've got like a whole society sort of peering in on it feels just really disproportionate to me.
It's quite easy to scare people, isn't it, with those kind of child narratives, because they use words like mutilation and things like that. And I said, but what it comes down to for me is that I've got an older sister, so I just kind of noticed what was affirmed or denied me because of my sex. So like the way my sister's needs were met were different than like I had, but I wanted. So I used to try and explain it like that. I didn't necessarily say I want to be a girl, but I gravitated to the things my sister was affirmed with, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So like it's simple things like when I went to school, it was like I was taught by nuns, and there was a different entrance. There was a boys' entrance and a girls' entrance, and I said, well, why can't I go in that way? And they said, well, no, that's where the girls go. I said, yes, that's where I want to go. But it's like simple things like that. And people, because I think it's funny now. I think, but at the time it was probably quite traumatic. I probably buried a lot of that trauma in humor. But like when I speak to my mum now, she just calls me her daughter, and it's like the most natural. If anybody says to my mum, that's not your daughter, that's your son, she'd go absolutely mad, because it disrespects my mum, because she knows how happy I am now. Yeah. And it's as simple as that.
And she knows you. I think it's really important to sort of hold both things as true, that children are, especially younger children, are on every possible level figuring out who they are. Like, so I think it's really important to sort of, I know lots of people who came out, for instance, really late in life, came out in terms of their sexual orientation and came out in terms of their gender identity. I know people that have identified as cis, then have identified as non-binary, people that have identified as binary trans, and then have sort of changed their understanding and identify. You know, we shouldn't be scared of change. We shouldn't be scared of change, including for children. We shouldn't be scared of children exploring who they are and their concept of who they are evolving and changing over time. That's real, because they're human, and so do adults. But the idea that therefore means that we should somehow refuse children any space to tell us who they are and to be affirmed in ways that they need. Well, you know, everything is made so high stakes. Doesn't matter if you go through the girls' entrance.
And then you're looking, you look at what's been talked about in the press today with Rishi Sunak, and you know, this guidance they're talking about that's going to force teachers to tell parents. I mean, the thing I worry about there is, what about the kid who's so scared to tell the parents that they tell a teacher in confidence? And then that teacher now has to tell those parents and gets you know, probably beaten up by the parents, you know, angry
So
father or something when they get home.
LGBT
You know,
homelessness
how do you
is
deal with
already
that?
well. So LGBT homelessness is already really
Yeah.
high, right, amongst youth.
Mm.
We do not need it to go any higher. The way that kind of safeguarding works in a school or in youth settings at the minute is that the kind of that child, the best interests of that child are at the heart of decision making, including about decision making on disclosure.
Mm.
And to me, that's correct,
Yeah.
you know. And I think that there is no doubt that the right thing for a teacher to do with a child that is coming out to them as trans or is coming out to them as someone that's questioning their gender is to
Mm.
talk to that child and understand other people at home or in your family you can talk to. Can I support you? So all of that is good practice, right? You
Yeah,
would just do it as
absolutely.
someone that cared about a child. But disclosing without permission carries so many risks. And I think similarly, some of the things they're talking about in terms of I find it really troubling, the idea that what's being briefed to the press, let's see what the policy actually says,
yeah.
suggests that not only children but also teachers will be allowed to kind of misgender children and disrespect their identity.
Yeah, we don't
And
need any more of that.
my God, but it's just bullying, right? It's
Yeah.
bullying.
But it kind of makes bullying okay, because like I think if you looked at that article, you might think, oh, there's this liberal school. Every school is liberal when they're trying to turn children trans or something, the way it's worded.
No.
But most schools are not the best places.
Really hard to come out if you're
Yeah.
LGBTQ plus. It's
Yeah.
not just hard to come out as trans, it's hard to come out as a kid, right?
Yeah.
And some schools do really good work, and some schools really struggle to keep LGBTQ plus kids safe.
Yeah, I think some
absolutely.
parents have noticed the change, because I've got a friend who's got 2 daughters, and she says, oh, they talk about gender all the time now. So is that a bad thing? Like I said, no, it's a good thing, because it's good. I think we're all gender questioning. I think gender questioning is something perhaps everybody has done at some point. What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? These are fundamentals, aren't
There
they?
is a really good organization called Diversity Role Models, which goes into schools and talks about these issues.
They're fantastic.
I have signed up to be a role model, so I have done that. I mean, it's really rewarding going in, talking to kids and teachers, you know, obviously at different levels, but you can see there's a need from teachers to understand things, because they really don't understand all the issues. And when they hear somebody like me who came out late in life, and when I explained to them why I couldn't do it when I was younger, because there was nothing there for me. You know, it's like I wasn't bullied because I wasn't out. The fear of being bullied was a thing that kept me in the closet.
Yeah. I remember being told by a teacher, you know, because you used to do the old dress up thing, and you can be a princess or whatever. You say, oh, well, if you wear that, you'll get beaten up. I was like, are you not going to stop them beating me up?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like that shouldn't be the baseline. Being beaten up should not be
it shouldn't.
You know.
Right. Let's talk about the Equality Act, the definition of sex.
Yes.
Oh gosh, not that again.
Yeah, that old.
That old chestnut.
That old chestnut, yeah.
We had the parliamentary debate, didn't we, last
week?
The
2 petitions.
And I thought that was so. I think there was somebody called Miriam Cates, and she was. Oh my gosh, it's like listening to evangelical Christians.
Did you watch it, Nancy?
Do you remember the Phelps family? The Phelps family. It reminded me of that. Why would you take these people seriously? You know, but they are being listened to, and you know. So, what was your view on that debate?
I mean, I think there was a lot of unpleasant rhetoric in the debate.
There was.
But that's a petitions committee debate. That in itself is not going to change the law. I think more worrying for me is the fact that our Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, has sought advice from our National Human Rights Institution, the EHRC, about whether or not it's beneficial to change the definition of sex in the Equality Act. And the EHRC has said, well, it might be beneficial. And what that means is we're in a situation where our National Human Rights Institution is kind of supporting the government to consider making a change that will be a fundamental rolling back of trans people's rights in the UK. So that's one of the things that we will, at Stonewall with the rest of the movement, have to fight very, very hard to prevent. And I think what you could see in the debate is a few years ago, I think the people who were more trans hostile wouldn't necessarily be as open about, I want trans women to not ever be able to go into a women's toilet, right? It was all, back then it was all kind of, oh no, it's just these sensitive services, so violence against women and girls services. And what you can see more recently, and you did see it in the debate, is people saying, well, yes, trans people shouldn't be allowed to just use very basic spaces like changing rooms and bathrooms, and no real engagement with how extreme of a position that is, and with what that means for trans people in their day-to-day life. And actually what it's going to be my wife that gets chucked out of toilets, not you two, actually. What it means for people, for women especially, who are gender non-conforming or butch or kind of masculine looking in any way. And that was that's quite shocking to me, is that we've got to a point where so many people are happy to say, well, yes, of course, no trans women should be able to go into a.
Well, I mean, it all ties into this nonsense we keep constantly hearing in the media about trans women and trans women are biological men, and all this kind of rhetoric that's continuously daily basis being thrown at us.
And it's all nonsense, right? It's all complete nonsense. I was talking to someone who I know personally, and they were kind of saying, they were asking me about kind of trans women using the toilet, and I was going, yeah. And they were like, so where do you think that a trans woman should go to the toilet? And I'm like, wherever she feels comfortable, my friend, wherever she wants to go. And like, for me, I just kind of think, I show off about this a lot because I'm proud. I turned 50 this year. I've been around a long time. I'm a lesbian. I've spent a lot of time in LGBT specific spaces. Like, on average, I am sure I have like weed in more toilets with trans women than the average cis woman has.
What's interesting to me though, because when I first started coming out into Manchester, it's a very kind of liberal, like, because I come from like a queer culture. I used to be a bit of a drag queen, and everybody out there, there's no male or female toilets. Everybody's walking around naked half the time in some of the clubs I've been in. And I was like, so I sometimes have to temper my, like, when it comes to debates on TV and stuff like that, and on Twitter, I've got to sometimes be the sensible one in the room when I'm not really, because
you're the sensible one.
I'm never the sensible one, but because I come from, so I because of my sense of humor came out of a kind of catty queer culture. I've got to be careful. I've had to tone police myself quite a lot, because sometimes I'm talking to women that don't know anything about that. They don't understand that there is a different language in my queer culture. So I mean,
100%. I mean, I've never had any kind of problem being in a toilet with a trans woman. I can't count how many times in a club I've found people shagging in the bathroom or snorting coke off a toilet seat, which I've always just thought is the grimmest thing. Like, least clean environment to do that. But that's a whole other thing. But
I mean, at least you use the shelf, not the toilet itself.
But I think it's become this thing, and sometimes I talk to other cis women who don't kind of live in our world, who aren't from a kind of queer background, and when I say to the extent that trans women are ever going to wee in toilets next to you, they've been doing it your whole life. Like, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. About that. And then people kind of go, oh yeah, and you go, yeah, nothing.
But you see, for me,
the most stupid thing about all this is how on earth would they even try to enforce this? I mean, it's just ridiculous.
I know. Like what? We're like carrying our birth certificates around. People are going to kind of cheek swab us. When I need to go, I need to go. Don't be trying to stop me and cheek swab me at the entrance.
I remember I had a conversation with Stephen Whittle about this, and he said, well, just ask for the bucket. If they won't let you if they won't let you pay, just ask for the bucket.
Well, we were saying, like, if it came to a situation where you were at work or something and somebody says, oh, you can't use that toilet, I'd have to drive home.
Exactly.
I'd have to drive home and come back.
So if the company's okay to let you drive home every couple of hours because you can't, there's no toilet.
People have said to me things like, well, why don't you use the disabled toilet? I was like, oh, great. Right. So there's a disabled person being like, what if they need to go? Right, is it going to be an orderly queue of need? Like, is it like I'm less of a person than this person? So they go, it's like ridiculous.
Well, so, I mean, I think your point about being less of a person, for me, I think that sometimes when people make these arguments, and I think some people know they're doing it, and I think other people it's genuinely unconscious. What they can't hear in what they're saying is that they are very much saying that there is a hierarchy of people. They are very much saying that kind of trans people and particularly trans women can kind of can only have rights in the space once the most trans hostile cis people are comfortable.
Well,
it's about discomfort,
Yeah. I mean, somebody like Maya Forstater, she sees me as a problem to be solved. And that is, to me, I find it very difficult, because I've tried to be a good faith, maybe understand her arguments, and on Twitter I say, well, have you but none of those people are interested in that, because what they do, they'll put something out, but they'll let the attack dog followers do the work for them. So while it might seem like they're an organization and they represent something that's they've got some ideas, but the problem is the people that follow them are the worst people on Twitter, and they will attack, and that's the problem. So there's no point really having any kind of discourse with them, because it never really ends well. And that's something I'll never learn, because I'm still on Twitter.
The way I look at toilets is that I think cisgender people need to remember that they don't own the toilets. They're there for everybody,
Exactly.
But we've got this kind of British thing. I think is it a British thing, or is it just a kind of, it comes out of a Christian kind of shaming culture?
Well, if you want to see how toilets are used, go to France, go to Paris.
Yeah. I mean, has anybody been on a beach in Europe? People just walk around doing, I was talking to a friend of mine. She goes swimming a lot, and she invited me to come swimming, and it was the first time in my life that, oh my God, I don't think I'd be welcome in a changing room. And she was like, "What the hell? Are you with me?" But because of this debate, because of the way this is,
I know a lot of people who feel like that. And people who I'm surprised that they feel like that, because in some ways they're very cushioned, and they're quite privileged, but I get it. It's scary, and I think that. That's what matters, like people's day-to-day lives. If you're in a position where you can't go shopping, you can't do your job, you can't go out on a Friday night and feel, if not perfectly safe, because I don't think any LGBT people ever feel perfectly safe, but at least confident, like in your surroundings, then that is a problem. That is a material problem. It's not some kind of abstract problem about defining words. It is a real problem for
practical,
an actual human person.
Yeah. Well, whatever they try and do to us, they're not going to stop us. I can guarantee you that.
Well, I'm not going to stop doing what I mean.
Nobody's getting back in the closet. I mean, that's what I always say. Nobody's going. No, trans people aren't going back in the closet any more than cis lesbians and gays are. The world will just have to get used to all of us.
I think that's a brilliant point to finish on.
We haven't quite finished. We need to talk about trans in the city quickly.
Oh, okay. Well, sorry, Vicky. So, I was preempting you.
Yeah. So I met you at Trans in the City a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
You were wearing this amazing green dress. I remember distinctly.
Yes. Bright green. It's my favorite color.
Yeah. And then I think you were there last year as well. And we had a discussion afterwards in the bar. I think I was sober. I can't remember. But it's always great to see you, Stonewall, represented at Trans in the City events, because that gives me a lot of hope in my heart, because I know there's a huge organization there that, Trans in the City has brought along to support us, basically. I mean, and it's great to see that. So thank you for being there.
Trans in the City and everyone in the team
They're amazing, aren't they?
Incredible work, really incredible work, and really support big organizations to think about trans inclusion in a very human and in a very deep way. So I love what Trans in the City do, but I think it's also just that it is a movement, right? Like Trans in the City are partners in the movement, Transactual are partners in the movement, Trans Safety Network, there are
Trans Safety Network.
We all have favorites. That's one of mine.
Yeah.
But so there are all of these incredible community organizations doing great work. There are Some of them are trans-Pacific, some of them are LGBT. You know, there are all of these organizations kind of within the kind of voluntary sector doing great work, and we all make the change together, right?
I'm so glad you mentioned Trans Safety Network, because the work Jess and Mallory do
Yeah,
is
amazing.
and their team. I mean, it's and they don't get a lot of funding. I mean, we try and help send them a few quid here and there. So
no, they do incredible
thanks
work.
for mentioning the grassroots.
Always, we've got a doing some work in partnership about online hate with Trans Safety Network at the minute.
That's brilliant. Yeah.
So I was down in Chippenham Pride this weekend.
Yes.
Brandon City were there.
Yeah.
They were doing a speakers stage. There were some amazing speakers there. Lord Michael Cashman was there. He also did a book signing, so that was a lot of fun. Lisa Power.
Was he?
Sorry?
Flogging his book.
He was flogging his book as well. Yeah.
Good.
Nothing wrong with that. So, I mean, Lisa Power and Michael Cashman, you know, they both spoke about Stonewall and the history, you know, how it all started but how they were both involved with it. Really interesting. You know, I mean, that's quite a few years ago, and compared to now, you know, the organization has grown to something much bigger. And then there was Ian Watkins, H from Steps. He was there. He was so funny, making everybody dance. He was really entertaining. And we also had Peter Tatchell and Linda Riley. I'll tell you, the lineup was
that's amazing.
The
that's
talks
the Manchester
were
Pride.
I came out of there feeling so kind of pumped up and ready to go. And then we had a podcast with you today. I'm thinking, wow, I'm not going to get another week like this.
There you go. I mean, like Lisa and Michael, so they're two of Stonewall's founders, and they're both people that are hugely active in the movement still, right? So I work closely with Lisa and Michael. Michael is an incredible advocate for LGBT rights in the House of Lords. Lisa is still massively involved, like Queer Museum, HIV organising. They are absolute giants. And of course, Peter and the Gay Liberation Front crew, you know, these are people that have done incredible work for decades and decades. And I think especially kind of, I mean, I feel so privileged to get to work with both Lisa and Michael. And one of the things that really strikes me about them, and I don't know if you thought this, is that they've not got any ego, right?
No, zero
like,
ego.
When I first met them and I was like, hello, founders, and what is your advice for me? I didn't quite say it like that, but, you know, I was a bit like, bit starstruck. And, you know, they both come from this just completely generous place of like, you know, we're all part of a movement, and you're taking the organization forward now. So I wish I was at Chippenham Pride now.
It was great. I mean,
well, I'm jealous. I wasn't there.
Speech. I mean, he's such a kind of powerful speaker. He's got this really loud voice, and when he's talking, it feels like he's talking directly to you. Yeah. And he was also being very kind of humble with it. He's saying, you know, it's not about me. It's about you and us working together. You know, that's
what I like about Peter. He has put himself in the firing line. He has walked into the fire a lot of times, and he's done the kind of things that Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion. I mean, not quite to the same
he was talking about
methodology, but
what happened with President Mugabe, and where he, you know, the security guards
did a citizen's arrest on Mugabe, didn't he?
Incredible.
Wow. Yes.
Yeah. So
maybe
I
should attempt something like that in the near future.
Well, so, I mean, when you talk about movements, right, there's different ways of working, you know, and Stonewall was set up to kind of talk to politicians and to try and talk to the mainstream, basically. That's what we were set up for. And GLF was always the counterpoint. Gay Liberation Front was always the counterpoint, you know, gluing itself to things. But they always worked together behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And I think, like, direct action, you know, I go to protests. I don't glue myself to things anymore. Maybe when I'm in a different job in the future, but, you know, but direct action and protesting and community organizing are every bit as much of the picture of LGBTQ plus change as organizations that are like funded organizations are, you know?
Yeah, so activism and its effectivity. What was your kind of favorite activism? You know, because the way I look at it is that if you're going to do something, make sure it's effective.
Yeah.
Peter was talking about, you know, a lot of things that he does. He makes sure that he's kind of okay legally, and that it's non-violent, but he also makes sure that it's going to be on TV.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah.
So, you know,
So I kind of think if there was an answer for all circumstances, we'd have had this sorted a long time ago. So, like, if this is the most effective way of doing activism. What I do think is that when different forms of pressure come to bear at the same time, that is when the most potential for change often happens. And there's some parts of that pressure you can't control because they're about events that happen in the world, and there's some parts of that pressure that you can be part of, and you can be the kind of very behind the scenes person, or you can be somewhere in the middle like Stonewall is. So we're very public and we're very visible, but we also are kind of quite mainstream. And you can be, you know, the person kind of organizing a direct action, or you can be just the people showing up at vigils and prides. And it's not always, to me, I've been doing kind of campaigns type work and policy type work for a long time. It's not always obvious what's going to be the last piece that kind of flips the switch, that does it. And I think, so I'm really in favor of like collaborating across all of those spaces and talking across all of those spaces, so that you feel it out together.
Yeah, for me, my activism has been going into the media, and obviously I've picked some quite hostile places to be in, but I think I kind of like the sparks that fly off that sometimes, because you know it does get people's attention. It does, like, because I got invited to go on podcasts sometimes where everybody just kind of sits in agreement and nods along, and I don't think that's boring. But I do like to have like a sensible discussion sometimes. But I think if you go on those things, like I was on James Whale's show the other night, to me that's just a comedy thing, and James Whale knows exactly the game he's playing. But I managed to win them over. You know, I managed to change the story, the narrative, because it was quite funny. James left, and then his other presenters came back.
So Frida and I were thinking of buying a tank, driving it down to Tustin Street, and then spraying 55 Tustin Street with rainbow colours. I mean,
yeah, we're going to try.
Can't have too much rainbow in Pride Month, I always feel.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of an extreme thing to do. And
I don't know, but if you could afford to hire a tank, if I could afford to hire a tank, I'd probably just do something more fun than that.
So in the remaining minutes we have then, Nancy, I guess the final thing we'd ask you is, what would be your message to the trans community and all of what we've just discussed?
Gosh, so
putting you on the spot now.
Yeah, no. Well, so if you are a trans person and you are living your life and you are having a good time and you are feeling positive about yourself, then that's good. Like, don't feel like you have to do more than that. You know, I think there's this huge pressure to kind of do more, but that's great, actually. And that is, you know, queer joy, trans joy is activism, is powerful. And, you know, so keep doing that, right? That's enough. And I think if you want to do more and get involved more, then there are loads of amazing organizations and community organizations that you can get involved in. But actually living your best life or just living a happy life is a really powerful form of resistance right now. And it's okay to expect cis people to pick up a bit of the slack. I think cis people need to put a bit more work in, frankly.
We need a big applause sound effect now. Vicky, have you got it? Thank you.
And I don't have an applause.
Oh, so thank you so much for taking the time.
No, it's been lovely.
I sent you that cheeky message on Twitter. She'll not reply to me.
I kept saying, Frida, she will reply. This is great. She's going to reply, and you did. So that was good.
But I was a bit set back because we asked Kim Petras and she said no.
Kim Petras hasn't answered yet. I don't know what's going
on. Still waiting for Kim Petras and Sam Smith.
Nancy, thank you so much for coming on and doing this, spending some time with us. Would you like to do the little song with us at the end?
Yeah, how does it go?
This is the don't forget to subscribe.
No, we can do. We go. Don't.
So Frida's going to lead us, and we have to sing along. It's very
be in the
and
music
the words
teacher.
are don't forget to subscribe. That's all.
Okay, I'm going to give it a go.
It just goes, don't forget to subscribe. Right. Okay. So on 3, 1, 2, 3. Don't forget to subscribe. Oh my God, that's the best one we've done.
We almost got it in tune then. That's pretty good.
And I think that was the best one we've done.
That was, it
There you
was.
go. You should always do the song.
Always do the song at the end. Yes.
Thank
So
you.
for anybody who's watching, listening, thank you so much. And yeah, don't forget to subscribe, come back, listen to us again. And thank you, Nancy, for coming on, being an amazing guest that you are. If you want to come back and talk about anything else, absolutely welcome. No
Thank
problem.
you.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Bye for now.
I'll sign us off there. Tatty bye.